Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hi, and welcome so much to the show, Better Sex. I'm here every week bringing interviews and content and ideas and hopefully inspiration to all of you out there, all of you listening, because I think sex is actually really important. I mean, if you don't want to be having sex, no judgment, that's fine. But I think for a lot of people, it's a crucial part of our expression of self and our sense of connection and intimacy with our partner. And so really, I'm committed to trying to bring things that help you create your best possible sex life. So this week's guest is Ian Kerner, and he is a therapist and a sex therapist in practice in New York City, New York, yes. And he wrote a book, turns out almost 20 years ago, called She Comes First. And this has been one of my most frequent recommendations to clients in my own practice. It's still in print. It still sells a bunch. She still gets a lot of good feedback about it. It's a great book about not just Cunnilingus, although that's a lot of the focus of the technique of the book, but really about what he calls cliteracy, which is really understanding female arousal and sexuality and orgasm. And I think it's a really important work. And I was just delighted that he was willing to take the time and talk about some of the ideas of the book, the writing of it, how he might have changed it if he wrote it today, and some of his thoughts overall about sex and sexuality. So delighted that he's here. Hope you enjoy the episode. So Ian, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Jessa.
I am excited to have this conversation, actually. I think it's going to be really interesting for people. Could you say just a little bit about who you are and what brought you to write She Comes First?
Oh, okay. So I am a licensed psychotherapist here in New York City and also an ASEC certified sexuality counselor. I've been working with patients for many years, individuals, couples, heterosexual, LGBTQ. I also teach and supervise therapists at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy here in New York City, where I train them in the principles and practices of sex therapy. And I would say I live and breathe sex by day and sometimes try and have it with my wife at night. If I wrote She Comes First. Gosh, it's going back almost 20 years, and the book's been in print now for probably going on 15 years. So I must have written it about 16 or 17 years. And at that time, certainly in my clinical work, I was running up against what I would sort of call cliteracy. A lot of men who did not really have a proper understanding, formulation, or respect for an accurate version of female sexuality. But more importantly, that work was near and dear to me because for most of my life, I had suffered with sexual dysfunction, namely premature ejaculation, and I was really unable to really create or sustain pleasure through intercourse, and I felt very debilitated and depressed by that. Eventually, it sort of led me on my own path to learn a lot about female sexuality, and that even if I had a penis that was fully functioning in my view and able to last as long as I liked, that it wouldn't necessarily equate to the pleasure of my partner. And so I really moved from sort of an intercourse model to an outercourse model, which is what I basically espouse in She Comes First.
Okay, so it was a solution to a personal problem or situation first, right? And then I guess you're saying you see, of course, application in your therapy practice for people. Like this takes a lot of pressure off of men, right?
I think so. When you can know that you don't have to make love simply through penis vagina intercourse. I mean, in my clinical practice, I actually see less cases of premature ejaculation today, but I do see many, many cases of psychological erectile disorder, either
Right.
situational ED or chronic ED of a psychological nature in young men. And when you really get down to it, most of this is anxiety that is focused around intercourse. So
Yeah.
I think getting out from under the shadow of the intercourse discourse is paramount for men and also important to their partners and the pleasure that's being mutually created.
Right, right. So again, part of what we see with clients, right, is what they'll call, or I'll call it too, performance anxiety, right? This idea that I'm supposed to impress my partner, something's expected of me, that creates a lot of anxiety. Doesn't that happen with cunnilingus as well? Right? Like there still can be a little bit of pressure to perform or know what to do, or.
Yeah, a couple of things. First off, I mean, She Comes First is very much focused on cunnilingus tactically, but conceptually, it's really focused on cliteracy and stimulating the clitoris persistently and consistently in ways that help a woman to achieve arousal and orgasm. I think that there is anxiety around cunnilingus. But it's a different kind of anxiety. I mean, very often in my practice, it's the men might have a phobia or a lack of experience around cunnilingus, but they don't generally have anxiety. It's often the female partners who have anxiety around receiving cunnilingus because of a lack of genital self-esteem, a concern that their partner isn't really enjoying it. And so I actually find more performance anxiety related to cunnilingus happening in the receiver pleasure than in the giver, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so how do you help people with the various things that get in their way of either giving or receiving oral sex? What are the you just named some of them. What are some of the problems people encounter with it? And then how do what do you suggest for them to overcome it?
Specifically with cunnilingus, or
Yeah. Let's start with cunnilingus.
Well, I mean, I really think it's important for partners to enjoy the giving of pleasure as much as they enjoy receiving pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of men haven't really wired through habit themselves to take enough pleasure in giving pleasure. So I would say, first of all, just start to focus on the pleasure and the arousal that you can create in your partner, and then notice in your own responses. You could certainly read a book like She Comes First, or I guess go online and look up techniques if you're worried about your lack of experience. In my book, I do a lot to dispel this idea that somehow a vagina would not be clean or hygienic. So there's a lot of disinformation or misinformation out there. I think it's very important for the giver of the pleasure, whether it's a man or a woman or somebody who's gender fluid,
Right.
to really let their partner know how much they're enjoying giving pleasure, how sexy and arousing it is, how turned on they can be by it, how the scent is arousing, the taste is arousing, the look and feel is arousing. I mean, I work with men who really get off and get very aroused on the whole process. It's very intimate. It can be very vulnerable, and just to be able to communicate that to your partner and to let your partner feel safe and secure with being vulnerable during the receiving of cunnilingus.
Mm-hmm. But I would imagine, well, I mean, I know this. I've had clients that don't necessarily find it arousing to give it yet.
Sure.
Right? Like it's a little bit of an acquired taste.
Well, you know what?
Then, not a bad pun, but
you know what? I mean, I don't really want to pressure anybody to do something that they are unequivocally or categorically not very open to. I mean, there are lots of men and women who don't enjoy giving blowjobs, or
right.
There are men and women who don't enjoy receiving blowjobs. There are women who don't enjoy receiving cunnilingus and men and women who don't enjoy giving it. I think more important is the idea, and she comes first, of the clitoris really being the powerhouse of the female orgasm, and how you create authentic arousal in each other's body. So it certainly doesn't have to be via cunnilingus, and I'm certainly not going to argue with a patient. I may try and use good, solid psychoeducation to recontextualize some of their anxieties, but if I can't succeed in doing that, it's not going to be my job to pressure either partner.
Yeah. So it's a good point that this is, like you said, about cliteracy, however you might stimulate it.
Absolutely.
Like however you might develop the arousal and the orgasm for a woman partner, it doesn't have to be with a mouth, right?
No, it can be with a hand. It can be with a penis used in different ways. I mean, I think we're really going through a fantastic golden age of sex toys right now, where there's just so much available. And so it certainly does not have to be via a mouth or a tongue.
Mm-hmm. And then for women who might be uncomfortable receiving it or inexperienced or whatever their obstacles might be, how do you work with people like that?
Again, I mean, I would really need to get a little bit at the vulnerability and the sort of belief around it. Every woman can be different. Some women say that it's an incredibly vulnerable act and they feel more vulnerable during cunnilingus than they do during intercourse, or for some women, receiving pleasure may be more difficult than actually giving it. And they may have a belief that connects to their own genital self-esteem. And I think, honestly, Jessa, I try and work very individually with the patient around whatever negative beliefs they might have. And I try and use empathy, honesty, and intimacy and connection, but mainly really solid science and psychoed to try and reframe negative beliefs into positive beliefs.
Right. So like you were saying that this is a hygienic area. There's nothing, inherently dirty or gross about genitals, about a vagina or vulva. I'm curious, do you have any particular comments or resources when you keep using the term, I think, genital self-esteem, which I think people do struggle with? Is that just a matter of psychoed, or do you have books or resources that you share with people? I think that would.
There was a book by Debbie Herbenek and her writing partner, Vanessa. I just can't recall the last name. They wrote a lovely book about genital self-esteem, as well as some articles. I think a site, have you been to the site omgs.com?
Yeah, right.
Popularity. I mean, I think that there's a site like that where you really find real women talking about how they like to give themselves pleasure, and a lot of mirroring of women who do have, I think, a healthy sense of sexual self-esteem, or certainly genital self-esteem. So I think, I've certainly turned to a site like that to help provide a counterpoint or to provide some mirroring to patients.
Mm-hmm. It's occurring to me now as I ask that question too, that I don't know if you've seen, there's at least an Instagram account called the Vulva Gallery. Have you ever seen that?
No.
So this woman is painting, drawings, portraits of different vulvas that I suppose people are sending her pictures or something. And she posts one a day, and it's a beautiful display of the lovely variety of genitals.
That might be a reason for me to create an Instagram account.
Maybe. Exactly. That could be a reason. But that could be another resource for women. People with vulvas, anyway.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm just taking a quick little break in the middle of the show. Most of you probably know, if you've been listening at all, that I have written a new book called Sex Without Stress. But what you may not know is that I have developed an online course to support you through the process. The book has a lot in it. It's a do-it-yourself process to totally transform your sex life, but it's hard to do it. And it's hard to do it alone without support. So I have been looking for a way to create an environment that's supportive and could help you actually get this stuff done. So what I've done is create an 8-week course There are webinars that you can watch live or you can watch later. There's materials, there are exercises and directions, and then I'm going to offer live online office hours. This is where you can get questions answered and get input on your situation. It's not therapy, but it's a place to come and help you move through the process. The next cohort starts January 28th, 2019, taking enrollment all the way up until then. You can learn more at sexwithoutstress.com. Easy to find the online course information there if you want some more information. I would love to have you join me. So another thing you talked about in the book was the concepts of foreplay, core play, and more play. And I was wondering if you would, speak to that a little bit. And are there different, techniques or approaches for those different stages?
It's a good question. I mean, it's been a number of years since I wrote the book. And I think what I was trying to do was, first of all, take what many people consider to be foreplay and recontextualize that as, not to use the metaphor of food, not so much an appetizer, but an entree, and to really think of things other than penis-vagina intercourse as a centerpiece of sex, as a way of having a complete act of lovemaking, and to actually use your imagination and ingenuity to reconceptualize foreplay. Because frankly, a lot of couples I work with, and I'm sure you do, pretty much get to intercourse almost as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And rely on sort of intercourse to do all the sort of the heavy lifting of generating arousal for both partners. And it's no wonder that there are a lot of women who don't reach orgasm, and there are also a lot of men who are not developing requisite levels of arousal and either losing erections or not able to reach ejaculation. And I think that there's very often a lack of psychological stimulation and a lack of eroticism and a lack of seduction. So I work with sort of, if you imagine that a play has, act 1, act 2, act 3, and I guess foreplay is usually act 1, and things like Cunnilingus and fellatio and direct genital stimulation kind of typically fall into act 1 foreplay. I kind of like to encourage individuals and couples to think of that more direct genital stimulation as act 2, or an intensification of something that's come before it, and to really use both touch as well as psychological stimulation to create a new act 1.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I say a lot of these things to my clients in maybe different language a little bit, but I stress to people, it's like so many couples. I mean, like I'm talking about a heterosexual couple right now, but like as soon as he's hard and she's wet, let's have penetrative sex. It's like, well, that's kind of silly to, barely get over the bar of arousal of what you need. Why not extend that, play in that?
And to develop a language for it.
Yeah. And even then, it doesn't have to culminate. It's not like it has to culminate in penis and vagina intercourse. That could be act 3, or that could just not be part of the play at all.
Absolutely. Or it could actually be part of act 1, and there's no reason that you can't start with, playing around, with intercourse or the penis against a vagina and reintroduce it. I just think this idea that, okay, once the penis is in the vagina, we're on the runway and there's no getting off.
Yeah.
I think that's a misconception.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever asked your clients this, but I've sometimes asked people, "How do you know when sex is over?" And they look at me like, "Well, of course it's obvious when one or both of us have an orgasm," as if that's the destination.
Right.
And it's kind of fun to challenge that idea. And I love hearing you talk about eroticism too. The psychological arousal and the sort of our brain is our biggest sex organ. It'd be nice to use it.
When couples come in, certainly many couples are having, I guess, what we could call bad sex, or have sex scripts that aren't really working. But I mean, the main issue that I come away with is people who want more intensity, more excitement, more intimacy, more novelty, and or are lacking a psychological quality that would come from really having the courage and the vulnerability to open your mouths, not just to kiss a penis or kiss a vagina, but to really communicate with each other in sexy ways that allow you to eroticize each other, and in healthy ways to objectify each other, and to see your partner as the center of your fantasies, and to let your partner know. It's really a shame how many individuals and couples really don't even have a kindergarten vocabulary to engage each other in arousal.
Right. And I think you said this before too, the courage to share that, right? It's incredibly intimate to share your fantasies, your eroticism with someone, even if, maybe even if you've been married for decades.
Some people don't even have the language to even address their own fantasies.
Right.
And people will say, well, I don't have a fantasy.
Right.
Like having sex.
Yeah. So I don't know how many editions the book, I guess I didn't realize how long ago you wrote it. So I apologize for asking you to think back so far. But, and I don't know how many editions you may have had, but I'm curious, from when you first wrote the book to now, how has it changed, or how has your thinking evolved? What do you wish you'd put in it that you didn't? Or
I have probably been invited at times to revise She Comes First, but I think if I started to get in there, I'd kind of rewrite the whole thing and probably screw it up. And
don't fix something that's not broken, right?
Yeah, it's been a book that still sells, and people still write very nice things about it on Amazon. And there's not a lot. I still stand by it and believe in it. There are aspects of the writing that I consider sort of sophomoric from a stylistic point of view. And I certainly was writing before I had much experience with LGBTQ patients, before gender fluidity and trans identities and queer identities were really, a common part of our vocabulary, and so I probably, bring that sense of awareness and diversity to the book. I suppose I'd be a little more sensitive to just possibly in the writing how, in focusing so much on the pleasure that I wanted male readers to be able to give to their partners, maybe I inadvertently objectified women in it. I mean, that I haven't really heard that complaint that often, but it's been something that I think about sometimes. But I like the book, and I stand by it for sort of all of its, beauty and flaws and imperfections. I really, out of everything I've written, I still like it. And, I'm a big reader, and I remember I came across an interview with Milan Kundera, who wrote one of my favorite books called The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he said, that title just is the title that if I could, I would give to every book I write, because it's really the theme and the idea and the ethos that I keep returning to. And so I kind of feel the same way about She Comes First. Like, if every book I wrote could be called She Comes First, I'd be just fine with that.
Right. Volume 1 through 10 or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, one thought I had when I was reading, and it's been a little while since I've read it, I've got to admit that, but there was a lot of technique in it for the giver of oral sex, right? Yeah. And I don't remember reading a lot about the receiver communicating a lot about what they wanted.
Right. Yeah. There is a lot of technique in there. And in fact, I think that's what has given the book its legacy. You'd be amazed. Men and sometimes women still do write to me and say, I think you may have had a typo because on page 200, you're talking about this routine and you say to do a tongue stroke up, but I really think you mean down. And it's like, oh, you're really getting granular there.
Right.
But so people really do appreciate techniques. And I think that a lot of great writers of sex fail to focus enough on the implementation. I mean, we have a lot of very powerful thinkers out in the world writing about sexuality. And a lot of people read those books and come into my office and say, well, how do I actually implement that? Like, I read this book and it had such a big idea. How do I actually go about implementing it? So I'm happy to have created a lot of technique. And you're right. I certainly focused, I think, on the vulnerability that can go into the receiving of pleasure. But in terms of actual positive communication about how to tell a partner how to make adjustments in the moment, or what feels good or what doesn't feel good, you're right. That's probably something that I could have addressed more directly.
Because I would assume, I shouldn't assume anything. I mean, I know that I talk to clients about ultimately you're responsible for your own pleasure, right? You enlist your partner, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
They're can be an active participant, but the ownership, to my mind, is often with the receiver, right? Like that. Yeah. We've got the giver with technique and ideas, but the receiver would have sort of an active role in that process.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Sometimes, I think what I'm really aiming for when I have sex, and what I'm aiming for my patients to be able to have, and sometimes why I help them predetermine a sex menu or a sex script, is because I really want them to get into a flow state where they can both really engage in a dance and mentally deactivate. I know that for a lot of my patients, either having to give feedback or being in the position of receiving feedback can sometimes, break that flow state. That's not at all a justification for not communicating if something especially doesn't feel good or could feel better. But I think, looking back at that book, I think I idealize the apogee of sort of sexual connection as sort of being in a kind of flow state.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, that's, what we aspire to, or lovely to experience, is that flow where you're not having to think, or orchestrate or critique. I want to give you a chance to talk about some of the other things you've written, right? And where people can find more out about what you do and what you offer.
Sure. I mean, at this point, I may start to work on a new book soon, actually. And you know how sometimes there's like a movie like Alien, and then they'll go make, or Alien and Aliens, and then they'll go make 10 more Aliens.
Right.
And somebody will say, okay, now it's 2018. We're going to really pick up where number 2 left off, and they want you to forget about everything that came in between. I kind of feel that way almost.
Okay.
Like, I really like She Comes First. I somewhat like my follow-up to it, He Comes Next, which was retitled Passionista in paperback form. I'm not so crazy about most of the other books.
Okay, so we just won't mention those, right? Like people, they really want to know, they can look it up, but yeah.
Yeah, but I have, I do write for CNN every few weeks, and I try and include the voices of other therapists in those pieces, and I try and write about things. Often I'm assigned a piece, but I often try and write about topics that are relevant to sexuality that are sort of part of the zeitgeist. And so, I think my CNN articles are probably worth checking out, and those can be accessed on through my website, iankerner.com. I guess you could also just go to CNN and start, searching for stuff. But, that's about it. I'm sort of just here in New York, and I see a lot of patients, and I do a lot of teaching, and I do my little article for CNN, and that's kind of about it. You
got a life too, so that's good.
Yeah.
Good to balance. And I'll put links for this stuff in the show notes too, so people can find your website and your books and things like that.
Sure. And for the last few years, I was involved with ASECT and the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and I was sort of spearheading media and advocacy. So we drafted a pretty cool position statement about sex addiction, which I'm proud of. And
good. Well, thank you for your work in the field.
Oh, thank you, Jessica, for having me.
Yeah, and thanks so much for taking the time to do the interview, and I appreciate it.
All righty. Take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.